podcast, an inside look at California politics and the state legislature. I am your host, Assemblyman Josh Hoover. Excited to be joined again today by the wonderful Chris Micheli, an attorney, a lobbyist, a professor, he does it all, and an author with the firm Snodgrass and Micheli. Welcome back to the show, Chris.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
I can't believe you're at almost 40 episodes now.
I know. Episode, I think this is 37.
That's awesome.
So, yeah,
Good
pretty
for you.
exciting, right? Yeah. Not a celebratory episode, we'll have to, you can't really celebrate 37.
Yeah,
although that's
right.
how old I'm turning
next
year.
Don't rub it in. I was once
actually, my wife's
too.
turning 37 this year.
Oh, okay.
And so I'm like, how are we going to do that? But yeah, crazy 37 episodes. I think, it's been interesting. We've had some really great guests on. I know you're one of the few repeat guests, so I appreciate you coming back on.
Happy to do so.
Always appreciate, the conversation. And I know, so what's been going on in your world? How has 2024 been treating you since the last time we talked?
Not too bad, obviously. We're thankful that House of Origin deadline is over. This year was particularly unique because, of course, every 4 years, California moves up its presidential primary. And I think we all sort of forget what happened 4 years ago, but it definitely changes the schedule. So the first week in March, basically nothing was happening because that was primary day, March 5th. The last week of March, of course, was spring break. And so those 2 middle weeks of March, there were very few policy committee hearings, particularly in the other house, in the state Senate. So when the legislature returned from spring break, we normally have 2, maximum 3 weeks to finish work. This year it was 4 straight weeks, and almost all the bills were heard. More than 1,600 were heard over those 4 weeks. So it was a very busy time.
Yeah.
Then you have maybe a 10-day break and then suspense. And then the week after suspense, House of Origin, all of you were on the floor for 5 straight days. Granted, not very long on Friday, but nonetheless, you won't do that again until the end of August, at the end of the legislative session. So I think everyone has been, pretty busy the last couple of months, definitely.
Yeah, last week was particularly busy, but only one really late night for the Assembly. So
yeah, and only one in the Senate. The Senate was at 9:00 one evening.
It was like
your latest was 7:30.
Yeah.
It's not like the old days. I was reminiscing, commiserating, however you might want to view it, with Sue Parker, who, of course, is your chief clerk and chief parliamentarian. And she had brought up, remember the, kind of old days when there were repeated late nights, sometimes into the wee hours of the next day during House of Origin, as well as, of course, end of session. And that we haven't seen in quite a number of years. I mean, late is, like after the dinner hour these days.
I think I want to say the 72-hour rule has helped a little bit with that, just because you kind of have to deal with some of these things
far less
earlier.
Waiting around.
Yeah.
That was another point that Sue Parker brought up.
Yeah, back in the day, you're waiting for last minute amendments, and you can't really do that anymore, right?
Exactly.
So,
that is a good thing, actually.
I think just for the actual process itself, it's actually kind of a good thing. Obviously, for the public, it's good because they get more time to read the bills, but also from a process standpoint, it makes sense.
Yeah.
So
definitely brings a little bit more calm to those closing days and hours. Yeah.
Yeah. Sue Parker does an amazing job. Obviously, the chief clerk of the Assembly, our parliamentarian who really makes that the legislature, or at least the Assembly, run smoothly.
Yes.
And educates us on the rules and what's going on if we forget or whatever. So
absolutely, yes.
It's love
keeps
having
you in
Sue
line.
there, for sure.
I always love how every once in a while a presiding officer may be at the podium there and forget something or miss dates, and she's right there to correct it and make sure everything is, all the T's are crossed and I's are dotted. So it's wonderful. And certainly I would be remiss in not recognizing her counterpart in the State
Yes,
Senate, Bernadette
Bernadette.
McNulty. Yeah, Bernie's wonderful as well. So yeah.
Amazing job. She's been there a long time, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
they've both, obviously Sue served under Dotson Wilson, who was the chief clerk and chief parliamentarian for more than 2 decades. And, Bernie keeps the Senate in check. And so they both are wonderful.
Well, I think we should keep saying nice things about Sue because I'm trying to get her on the podcast. So I'd love to.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe I think in the fall.
She's fabulous.
Just to talk about, the legislature, right? The assembly, parliamentary kind of workings. And I don't know. I think it'd be a really interesting conversation because she just sees things from a different perspective.
Absolutely.
Than everyone else does. And I just think it would be really cool to pick her brain on that.
She is one of the 3 elected officers of the state assembly.
That's right.
So she's not any ordinary staffer.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, we've had some of those on too. That's okay. But yeah, so I would love to have Sue on. I have heard she may or may not listen to this podcast occasionally.
Oh,
so,
okay.
If she hears all these
I'll try
nice
to
things,
encourage
maybe
her to
we'll
do so, yeah.
But that would be really cool. But yes, I mean, crazy, definitely crazy few weeks. I think on that note, let's just jump into, the recap. So for the listeners that don't know, obviously last week was our House of Origin deadline, which is kind of a fancy parliamentary procedure or term for essentially every bill that got introduced in the assembly had to be passed out of the assembly by last Friday. And similarly in the Senate.
With a few exceptions like urgency clause measures, but...
I mean, as with any rule, right, it can always be
there are
waived.
always exceptions, yes.
There's always exceptions. So obviously constitutional amendments, for example, do not adhere to those deadlines. If your bill has an urgency clause, it can...
Tax levies.
Tax levies, things like that. I mean, there are certainly exceptions, but for the most part, the vast majority of bills
absolutely
needed to be passed out of the assembly by Friday if they originated in the assembly, hence the House of Origin deadline. And similarly in the Senate.
Yep.
So lots of work to be done. I think you tweeted a couple weeks ago about, 900 something bills that were...
So about 800, more than 800 bills, passed off the 2 houses during those 4.5 days, if you will. And the other stat that I put out was that of the introduced bills... 75% of them in the Senate passed their House of Origin, while 61% passed the state assembly.
Interesting.
So definitely big difference.
Yeah.
Historically, it's been probably a taking out the COVID years.
Yeah.
Usually the low has been maybe 55% and a high of 75 or 80. So the assembly definitely fewer than normal. Again, the comparison is number of bills that passed off the floor in comparison to the total number introduced.
Yeah.
The Senate was obviously much higher at 75%. Basically, 3 out of 4 bills that were introduced this year in the Senate have already passed the Senate and over to the Assembly.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What were your, just on the week, were there any bills that stood out to you that you kind of remember off the top of your head in terms of that were interesting? Or, I mean, I've got a list here that I'm going to go down to, but I didn't know if there were any that stood out to you that you thought were interesting from last week.
Well, there were a couple of bills that, struggled to gain passage. Several, were amended so that they were more palatable to a majority. But definitely in the environmental arena, there were definitely some bills that struggled on the floors of both houses.
Yeah.
There were definitely a number of bills I forgot to count.
Yeah.
You got to double check the number that were moved to the inactive file. That's usually done as an indication that they lack sufficient votes.
Yeah.
So there were a large number, particularly in the assembly, that eventually got there. Some got there earlier in the week.
Yeah.
And others, I remember one bill that I was involved with got moved to inactive Friday morning, shortly before you adjourned for the week. Nice. So
there you go.
It was held on the, as a part of the agenda all 5 of those days.
That's
and then
funny.
Finally, it wasn't taken up ultimately,
Yeah, it's really interesting because a lot of people make note of the fact that, at least on the assembly, right, we didn't vote a single bill down, right, that actually went to a roll call vote. not a single bill failed. That being said, so a lot of people point to that and say, well, we don't kill any bills.
Yeah.
That being said, most of the bills that died were never called to a vote.
Exactly.
They were moved to the inactive file.
Yeah.
They stalled, right? And
Right.
they weren't voted down, which I think if you don't have the votes, generally speaking, especially in your own house, a lot of folks just tend to give up on the bill for the year,
Yeah.
which is a good way of stopping some bad bills.
Absolutely.
And I think I will take that. For the legislation that I find problematic, I think that's just as good as voting it down.
No doubt.
Yeah,
And looking back over the last 15 years,
yeah,
basically less than 1% of the bills actually fail passage.
right,
But I preface that statement, as I did, I think, in a tweet, that you have to note that several bills were amended
right.
to either have groups go neutral,
Yep.
or perhaps ensure that there were sufficient affirmative votes to clear either
Yeah.
floor. And again, as we've talked about, a number of bills were just simply not taken up.
Right,
And so, yes, I mean, if you don't pass, it requires an affirmative act, right?
right.
So if the affirmative
Yeah.
act doesn't occur, it's not being voted down, but you didn't pass either. So
Exactly.
it's a different way of failing passage, if you will.
Yeah, it was interesting. There was some legislation,
Yeah.
banning. I think it was like procurement of plastic water bottles. So there
Yep.
was banning the sale of fragrance air fresheners.
Mhm.
There was a number of bills that even a bill on actually landlords and screenings
Yep.
that all failed. It didn't really get talked about because they didn't get voted on, but
Right.
did fail for the year. So it was
Yeah.
interesting. But some of the ones that passed, I mean, the education space, there was a bill that passed to prohibit universities from using legacy or donor preferences in admission decisions. We actually passed a bill by a colleague of mine in Sacramento, Kevin McCarty, to add a financial literacy requirement to high school students for before they leave high school, taking a financial literacy
Will that
course.
bill, if assuming passage, will that be enough to pull the measure from the November ballot that's an initiative that has qualified to require?
That's a good question. I mean,
Mhm.
and then we've talked about a little bit on the last couple of weeks of the podcast that I think the deadline to do that is the end of June. It's June 27th, right?
That is correct.
And so, I guess time will tell on that. I'm not sure if that's the aim there or
Yeah.
I mean, in theory, if it mirrors kind of what the proponents are trying to do,
Yeah. Well, I'm
it'd
not
be
sure
an
that
easier.
the last time I looked, which, was a number of weeks ago, there
Yeah.
wasn't any organized opposition to the ballot measure.
Right.
So
I don't
perhaps the proponents would love to save themselves some
maybe
money.
save
And
yeah, exactly. Save the
Yeah.
resources. And
I think they spent at least $5-7 million
Wow.
to get it
Yeah.
on the ballot. So
No, it'd be interesting. I mean, I think it's something I've heard about from constituents that, for the most part, overwhelmingly support
yeah,
the idea of teaching kids, some form of financial literacy at the
Absolutely.
high school level.
yeah,
I'm definitely supportive of that. I think the one concern always with any high school graduation requirement is it's an opportunity cost, right? I mean, there you are obviously, if you're taking a class in this, you are not taking a class in something else.
sure.
And so, I think that is always the key balancing point between, and I'm an education nerd, so I always
Right.
get into this stuff, but
Yes.
between a graduation requirement, which means you have to take at least a semester of something before in the 4 years in high school,
Yeah,
or an elective where you actually can elect to take that course while you're in high school, but it's not required. So if you want to
Yeah.
take something else, you still can. And I think so. I do think that that's always the balancing act, right?
Absolutely.
And I think sometimes we strike, something maybe doesn't need to be a requirement, but very well could be an elective, and vice versa. So yeah, it's interesting.
Well, it's interesting. Last night I was out at UC Davis, my undergraduate alma
Yeah.
mater, speaking to their pre-law society, and we actually talked about, required courses both as an undergrad as well as in law school, and how many should be required, like, the bar tested course in law school.
Yeah.
But, you also don't want to mandate everything because you want to provide opportunity
Right.
for students to broaden their horizons, whether as an undergrad, even a political science major, you should
Yep.
take art history and anthropology and other things. And
Totally.
likewise in law school, even if you're convinced that you're going to be X type of lawyer, you should still explore
Exactly.
other subjects. So you don't want to mandate every course for a high school graduate, but
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of always the tricky part is if you required every class that you have to take in your high school career, then
yeah,
it would get pretty, pretty much everyone would have to learn the same things. But there's some amazing elective courses
I
that,
know. Yeah,
especially in the like career technical education space or the
absolutely.
engineering space or whatever computer science, I think is not a
Yeah.
requirement in high school in California. So, I mean, there's so many things you can still get exposure to before you head to college or
Yeah, I mean,
wherever you're going next.
I always appreciate students who have a, clear idea, if you
Yeah.
will, of what they want to study in college or something. But
Yeah.
hopefully they're getting exposed to lots of different things in high school.
Yep.
I'd rather they come in, without a declared major yet and
Yeah.
explore the first year or two of college and then decide what they want to do.
I mean, that's what I did. I felt like it served me much better.
Yeah.
Just, being able to learn about different things. But,
Yeah.
and the last bill in the education space was actually my
Mm.
bill, so I'll mention it. Since
As you should.
AB 3216, which essentially requires school districts to have a policy on limiting smartphone use during the school day. And
Right.
so this passed overwhelmingly strong bipartisan support. I was very grateful. Actually, my colleague from Long Beach, Democrat, Assemblymember Josh Lowenthal
Mhm,
spoke
mhm.
in support of it as
Yeah.
well. Very kind of him to do that. And so he's actually coming on the podcast in a few weeks
Oh,
as well.
great.
So he'll
Yeah.
be our first Democratic legislator on the
All
podcast.
right.
So we're
Don't
excited
forget to
have-
ask him about his mom and dad and their service.
Absolutely. Yes, I will. That's a good point.
It's quite the
Bonnie
family
and
tradition.
Alan, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, he'll be coming on to talk about some things, but, him and I, and as well as the chair of the education committee, Al Marasucci, have been
Yep.
working together on this bill. We're all joint authors on it.
Oh,
And
wonderful.
I think it's, it's interesting. I was a little worried it was going to have some trouble, and it sailed through. So
Okay.
I think it's definitely, the tide has turned a little bit on the cell phone issue
Yeah.
in schools and the distractions that it causes and kind of the social interaction that it interrupts and all of that. And I think the research is stronger every year that we probably shouldn't have just full access to these during the school day. So
Well, I recall my kids, certainly in middle school, they were required to drop their phones
yeah,
at the office and pick them up at the end of the school day.
there you go. Yeah. Well, and every school's like some of the districts that are doing this already, which there's a lot of them that are
Mm.
already doing this. A lot of them do it differently. Some of them have you put your phone in a pocket at the front of the classroom,
Right.
right? When you walk
Yeah.
in. Some of them have you just turn it off and put it in your backpack during the day.
Yeah.
Some of you have them put them in these pouches that kind of seal, so they keep them on their person, but they're not accessible during the day. So there's a lot of different approaches to it, but
Yeah.
I do think that the administrators I've talked to, the principals and such, have just reported really great success with just having those limitations in the class during the school day. So
Well, I mean, I hate to say it, but I've given many guest lectures to
that's right.
undergrads and
Yeah.
others over the last few years and have found a lot of them with their,
I bet.
laptops open. And
Yeah.
of course, I can't see them, but I
How
have
much
been
of
told
this are
some
you taking
stories,
in?
that, well,
That's got to be tough as a professor, though.
this is actually kind of funny. So I've done it quite regularly for a former
Yeah.
legislator who teaches at UC Berkeley undergrad. And a couple years ago, my wife went down with me, and she sat in the very back of the class. And so, there are 50 or 60 Berkeley undergrads in the class.
Yeah.
And she said that a fair number of them had other non-school related things on their laptop, right? But she said there were a few. She said she was genuinely impressed. She pointed out a woman who was maybe 2 rows up from her, and she looked like she was online shopping. But my wife said, but every time you said something that she thought was worthy, she would click the screen and type in her notes, and then she'd go back to the online shopping.
That's great.
Then you'd say something, and she would click over and type up her notes, and then go back. So
she just,
in
efficient.
this case, she must have been paying some attention,
That's funny.
right? Yeah,
that is funny. That is a really great way to a perspective on the class.
Yes,
See it from the back of the classroom.
From the very back.
That's pretty great, actually.
My true eyes and ears in the back of the classroom.
It's tough in college, right? Because it's probably harder to limit that kind of stuff in college.
Oh,
but,
sure.
It's got to be tough, teaching to a bunch of heads down or whatever.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those things in my law school classes, most of the students take notes on their laptop and which
I get. I type faster than I write, so I get it. But
I don't know. Even I ended up always taking handwritten notes, and then I would type them up afterwards as a refresher.
And then it kind of gets it more in your brain. That makes sense.
That's what I found.
The problem is it's also it's not legible, right? Like for me, I'm like,
well, of course, only I could read it and type it in.
There?
Yeah. That's funny.
That's a problem too.
Yeah, but I always found that was a great way of helping me learn and remember some things. The reality, of course, even when you're typing, let alone writing, you don't pick everything up, right? Yeah. But sometimes when you're then retyping those written notes, it's like, oh, and the professor also made this point or that and added in. So,
yeah, my kids have finals in school this week. Well, at least my oldest is. Yeah. And so he's been a little stressed this week.
It is.
His first time doing finals as a freshman. So.
That's awesome, though.
I remember those days. It's not fun.
Yes.
So in the business arena, some of the bills that passed, SB 961 requiring cars to have speed limiters or speed warnings. I guess they've been working to amend this bill, but I still have concerns about it. That passed the Senate, is now headed
Senator
to our
Reiner's
house
bill.
in the Assembly. A bill to eliminate plastic bags in grocery stores by 2026 passed, and so that's moving forward.
Yep.
So
we've revisited that topic a few times.
Many times. Yeah. So, and that, a few years ago, obviously, famously, we banned plastic bags, but then created these new thicker plastic bags that now they're trying to eliminate. Quite a few bills actually on self-driving vehicles moving forward. So I've got lots of thoughts on that, probably for a future podcast. But
I was going to say you could do something dedicated exclusively to that, or maybe AI.
We might
general.
do it. Yeah, we might
probably
do
that.
Should. But
well, it's interesting. There have been a few pieces even recently about. Obviously, the EU has been really at the forefront.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, California is right there. I know that. The chair of your Assembly Privacy Committee, for example, has even had discussions at the national and international level in terms of, what should California do? And I mean, this is really a hot topic across the country, across the globe, really.
It is. And I don't have a lot of the stories in the show notes, but I mean, there have been, I think Scarlett Johansson has been talking, in a lawsuit
about whether
now
they took
about her voice
to be
right, and I mean, really a lot of unexplored legal territory here, right?
Absolutely.
And I think it's going to be interesting to see how the courts work it out. Can the legislature or the Congress, can it keep up with the pace at which the technology is moving? I think that's a big question mark. How much should the government be involved? I mean, obviously, protecting privacy has to be an important role of government. And so I think, there's definitely conversations to be had
well,
there.
As you know, I mean, concerns over AI, for example, last summer of 2023, was a principal item in the Hollywood, workers' strike.
The workers' strike, right? The AI performances, artists, whether it's music or acting. I mean, there's the technology is moving at such a rapid rate.
Right. I've been reading in the legal press, not just concerns amongst law students and law school administrators, but also in the practice of law and how the use of AI is utilized in the practice of law, and I'm sure in many other professions as well. Certainly, It's
really interesting. I mean, obviously, I believe it was the CEO of Google or Alphabet, I guess, who talked about how AI is going to be as big as fire and electricity were, right, for mankind or humankind, which I think is a fascinating statement. I mean, I guess time will tell on that, but if that
sounds rather daunting. But,
if that is anywhere close to true, it's incredible, right?
Yeah.
So certainly some AI things going on as well that we're going to continue to be talking about, and then that bill on banning Clear at California airports, which we actually polled on this podcast a few weeks ago. It was not a popular bill, but that is actually moving forward in an amended form as well.
Well, I have to admit that I've finally put in an application for TSA pre after all these years.
Good for you.
But
it's
about
like $70 for
it wasn't the cost thing.
It
was like you have to go and make an appointment somewhere and all that.
Go to Staples or something and get your face scanned or whatever.
It was just, dislodging myself from my desk or the Capitol. But the funny thing is, about 2 months ago, my wife and I went down to visit my son in Orange County. He goes to college there, and there was so much traffic. Yeah. And then for the first time ever that day, we found that the public parking right across from Terminal A for Southwest, all 6 floors, it was closed. So we had to go around and come back to remote parking.
Wow.
So we got there, of course, my wife's TSA pre, and she's heading there and she says, you've got to do Clear. Otherwise you're not going to make the flight.
Wow. Yeah.
So I literally ran over to them and I said, how long does this take? They said, about 5 minutes. And, they take the eye scan and your fingerprint and check your ID and all that. And then they brought me up and I did make the flight on time.
So you're now a Clear member.
I'm a Clear member, but we flew into Long Beach, which is close to Chapman in Orange County in downtown Orange. And then we flew home that Sunday afternoon from John Wayne. And so got dropped off and we were walking in. Of course, there's the main line and then it says TSA pre. And I went up to one of the airport workers and I said, where's the Clear line? They said, oh, we don't have it here.
Wow.
And I said, oh, come on.
Wow.
I just paid for it out of Sacramento, and I can't even use it on my return.
So that was John Wayne, you said?
Yeah, that was John Wayne.
In Orange County? Wow.
Yes.
So
now, there is Clear at Long Beach.
Interesting.
So a trip 2 or 3 weeks later to visit our son and see one of his lacrosse games. We flew in and out of Long Beach, and it was fine. I got to use it flying out, but not at John Wayne. Yeah, Sacramento has it. Yeah. But funny story, a couple of weeks ago when it was pending on the Senate floor. And we were standing outside to get in. There was a long, long line to get into the swing space. Right? And a fellow lobbyist said, I've got an idea, talking to a group of us in line. And he says, I think we should ask Senator Josh Newman, the author of the bill, to add a provision to set up a Clear line for the swing space. And then he'll get the whole third house to lobby in favor of his bill. And
that actually isn't a bad strategy.
Exactly.
That's not a bad strategy.
I don't know that anyone pitched Senator Newman on that idea, but I thought that was pretty clever.
I mean, the line getting into the swing space it can be, I should say, always
not
is.
On a regular basis.
But on days where you have a lot of folks come in to talk to their legislators, particularly large groups, it gets really, really long.
Oh, yeah. And by the time, you could spend easily 20, 30 minutes. I spent about 35 minutes the last time. And then when you get in, there's the elevator issue.
Right. The elevator that's really the bottleneck, I would say.
Well, in this last time, I walked 6 flights of stairs and got in, and the meeting was like halfway over. I joined a group in a legislator's office. And of course, little drips of sweat are coming down my cheek after I literally tried running up the 6 flights.
Well, you definitely will get more stair work.
Yeah,
for sure.
For true. That is true.
But so it's a problem. That is a problem, especially on these busy weeks. But
well, I remember a former legislator telling me that the original plan, when there was 6 elevators available, it would have been fine. Right. Of course, as you know, 3 are technically out of commission to the general public, and so and then we've had instances where one One week there were 2 of the 3 public elevators that were unavailable, and
I mean,
that was
how do you
pretty
even
brutal.
do that? I don't even
Well,
know
there were
how
a
it
lot of
works.
stair walkers.
A lot of stair walkers, right?
Well, the other part is, from the old annex,
Yep.
they were shorter flights, number one.
Okay. Yep.
But on the second floor, legislator offices were there.
Right.
Second,
Right.
third, fourth, fifth,
Right.
and sixth.
Not as high.
Here, you have to go 4 floors just to hit the first legislator
Yep.
office. And those are much
Well, and
longer
there's
flights.
some folks on eighth floor as well, right?
Of course.
So
Goes as
I
high
mean,
as 8. Governor's office on 9.
that is a lot of
But the
stairs.
first floor of legislators is the 4th floor.
It's
In the
incredible.
old annex, it was 2. I always walked 2 and 3.
I always forget there's no one on the third. I always thought there were a couple people on
Senate
the third.
committees,
Got it.
the sergeants of both houses,
sergeants
Leg
are in
Council,
there, yeah.
Department of Finance, but
Right.
no legislator
Yeah.
offices, right?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, that's funny. Well, I think just to finish up the recap of the bills, I think there was a number, and we're going to talk a little bit about a couple more later, but
Okay.
there was this labor bill, obviously, on allowing striking workers to
Yes, a repeat from last year.
get
that the governor
unemployment
had vetoed.
benefits.
Mhm.
Certainly something the governor vetoed that I think I don't think anything has changed on. So we'll see how that moves
Arguably,
forward.
the situation has gotten worse financially.
It
but
really has, right? It really has.
It's probably the same outcome, pass the legislature and get to the governor's desk. Yeah.
Exactly. And then some really interesting bills on housing. A bill that empowers the AG to penalize cities for violating housing law. That's going to be interesting. A bill banning large corporations from buying housing and turning into rentals. Now, I
Yeah.
think this was, you have to own a certain amount in California before this triggers
Would
or
kick
something,
in.
right?
Right.
But I mean, even still, that is a big
Yeah.
policy change. And then,
Well, we know the attorney general has sued some local jurisdictions like Huntington Beach,
yes,
in
yeah.
terms of their housing approvals or lack thereof.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and then finally, a bill. There are actually a number of bills on that address, or impact landlords specifically, but
Yeah.
prohibiting landlords from charging pet rent, with exceptions for certain breeds and property owners. But that is obviously a pretty contentious bill as well for anyone that owns a rental property and
Yes.
wants their property to obviously to allow who they want in their property, and ask about pets. I think is a huge policy shift.
Although
as
I've
well.
found over the last 25 years that
Yeah.
any bill dealing with animals, one way or the other,
Yeah,
always leads to controversy.
that's so true though.
Yeah.
It's so true.
They've been some of the most contentious bills over the years. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there are, people on both sides of that issue, who believe strongly in whether it's adoption policies or,
Yeah.
can you charge people more rent or deny them, housing based
Yep.
upon the type of animal they have, anything. It generates controversy on both sides.
Totally.
Yeah. Yeah.
I probably shouldn't admit this on the air, but in college I lived in a no pet
Yes.
apartment.
And you had a
with
pet?
A pet, yeah.
Oh.
So this undermines my argument, I think. Yeah, we had this little Chihuahua, best dog we've ever had. I mean, he was. My wife and I got him right before as a wedding gift, actually.
Oh my gosh!
Which I know is kind of funny in itself, but he was
Somebody gave it to you, or
yeah.
you?
So
Okay.
it was actually abandoned in Fresno, where her sister lived at the time.
Okay.
Just ran into her sister's apartment and jumped on her couch.
Oh my gosh!
And
so that was her wedding gift to you?
Yeah, this adorable dog. She snaps a photo, sent it to my wife. Hey, if I pay for all the shots and everything, can I give this to you as a wedding gift? And we were like, oh, how do you say no to that?
Right.
So we best dog we've ever, I mean, it's just an amazing dog. But he's, 5 pounds. I mean, he's a tiny dog.
Right.
Never barked. I mean, which is weird for a
That's
Chihuahua.
fair. I was just
or
going to
whatever.
say, that's usually what you have to worry about.
And literally for 2 years of our lives, we lived, in this place where we would put him in a bag every night and just carry him out and walk him across the street to go to the bathroom and then carry him back in the bag. And no one ever, whatever. It was hilarious.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, it's, I mean, obviously people love their pets and that's, that is
We've been dog lovers for
story
15
that
years, yeah.
demonstrates that very clearly to put up with that for 2 years. But, I do think there's some issues there. So we'll see how that bill continues. And then the last thing I'll mention is my bill to implement the auditor's recommendation on tracking homelessness spending in
Yes.
California did pass the
Right.
Assembly.
Yeah.
Overwhelming bipartisan support, which I was really grateful for. And so excited to see that one move forward because there were some cost concerns there that we're trying to deal with in the
Yeah.
Senate. So hoping that thing gets all the way through. So we'll report back on that in the future.
I think you and I have talked before that the two biggest questions I get from, non-capital types who know or find out what I do ask, where did all the money go in homelessness spending?
Yep.
And how did we blow a multi-billion-dollar surplus and turn it into a multi-billion-dollar deficit? Those are by far the top two questions I always get. So, I think that auditor's report and keeping better track of where that spending is occurring, although it should be applicable regardless, whether it's prison spending, Medi-Cal spending, homelessness, whatever.
It really should be. I think homelessness is particularly important because we're getting such bad results. Right. And I think, that's why I've chosen to highlight that. But I think you're right. Any taxpayer dollars that we're spending to provide a service, we should know where the money's going and if it's working, right?
Yeah.
So, excited to push that forward. We'll do some rapid fire stories of the week here.
Okay.
And because I know we got to get you out of here.
Oh, no.
But one of the big bills that we debated was on the minimum wage increase. So, last year, obviously the legislature passed. Was there? Oh,
last year.
Yeah, right. Last year we had the fast food worker $20 minimum wage, healthcare worker $25 minimum wage. This bill specifically would delay the new healthcare worker minimum wage, I think by about a month or something like that.
From June 1 to July 1.
Basically to shift it to a different fiscal year.
Correct.
Because the cost of that mandate
it's sizable for the
on our state budget is, I think, somewhere in the $4 billion range.
Yeah.
And so we literally passed
the
bill.
Administration's estimate.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. So we literally passed a bill, and I wouldn't say we all supported the bill, but the legislature passed a bill to delay that implementation a month so that we could get it off the books for this budget.
Right.
Really kind of kicking the can, honestly, in terms of the expense. But I just thought that was interesting. My colleague James Gallagher gave a pretty great speech on that bill about if you really support this policy, then you should probably vote. It probably shouldn't support this bill because you're delaying it. Just own it. But I think I thought that was a really interesting move, that a bill that was just signed less than a year ago is too expensive for us. So we had to. So.
Well, as I understand it, there was obviously some concern and reluctance about signing the bill, knowing that last summer we were facing a tough budget situation. Certainly you're seeing it, I think, with a lot of the fast food restaurants and the impact of the April 1 increase to $20, which, some may debate is not a sufficient wage in some parts of California, but nonetheless, a lot of the fast food restaurants are struggling with that financial burden as well. So, there's a cost associated to these things. It doesn't mean that they may not be justified. It just, there are cost consequences of those.
Well, I think there's costs, especially on the fast food issue, right? If the cost of labor goes up, and I think most people agree that there needs to be a reasonable minimum wage. I think the question is, where does that line need to be drawn? And I think a lot of folks would say $20 is above where the line should be drawn. But I think, you increase labor costs like that, it obviously increases costs for consumers as well, and businesses, obviously. But, it's really the consumer that ends up paying more.
Of course.
And that's what we're seeing right now. And then in addition to that, I have, in the last 3 months, a huge host of fast food and fast casual restaurants in my district that have closed.
Okay.
And I think that is going to be a consequence of that as well. Is we're going to
and certainly automation. There's been some stories about, reducing head count in some fast food restaurants and turning to automation. It's interesting in terms of the amount. I don't know what the perfect amount is, but I do recall 7-8 years ago when the business community was lobbying against then SB3 by Senator Mark Leno from San Francisco, that put the wage, it created 2 tiers, one for smaller businesses, 25 or
Oh, yeah.
fewer, had it trail by a year.
Right.
That's why the statewide, and then it went to a cost of living adjustment once it hit
Right.
$15 an
Right.
hour. One of the arguments we made is if you're going to do it, have some geographic distinction.
Yes.
In other words, we were going from $12 to $15,
Right.
give or take, and maybe 15 is at that time very appropriate for like a San Francisco, but not for Bakersfield,
Right.
if you will, or something like
Right.
that. So there ought to be some
Makes a lot of
geographic
sense.
recognition, but those arguments did not prevail at the time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. No, I mean, the diversity of California when
Right.
it comes to, whether you're LA, San Francisco, Fresno, San Diego, all the way up to Redding and, rural Central Valley and
Yeah.
rural North State. I mean,
Right.
there's a lot of different places to consider. And
No, I mean, there's an argument to be made that in some areas of the state that even
maybe
$20
20 is
is
fine.
well, or that
It's-
20 is insufficient
Yeah.
in some areas, but it's more than enough in other
Exactly.
areas. And
Yeah,
should that be taken into consideration or not?
I think it's a great point. I got to give a quick shout out to
Yes.
Assemblymember Vince Fong, now Congressman Vince Fong.
Congressman-elect.
Congressman-elect. You're right, June 3rd, I think he gets sworn in.
Yes, right.
So Congressman-elect Vince Fong, who has been a colleague of mine, obviously, well, only 2 years, I guess, but
Yeah.
has been in the legislature quite a while, and actually has been a really great mentor for me as well, in kind of learning the ropes of the assembly.
Yeah.
Won a special election last week and was his last day on Friday.
Wow.
So yeah,
Sad to see him go.
yeah, we said farewell to our colleague, and it was interesting to hear that he got a lot of bipartisan,
Yeah. Well, he served as
speeches.
vice chair, obviously, of
Mhm.
budget for many years, transportation and other committees. And
Yeah,
I think, there's no question he's, has strong
yeah,
Republican voting record and views, but I think he worked very hard with the chairs of those
for sure.
key committees over the years and certainly expressed the Republican caucus point of view, but was never,
Yeah.
mean-spirited or difficult to work with. And I think all those people like Assemblyman Phil Ting, the former chair of budget, spoke very highly of him
yeah.
when they worked together. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think rightfully so. It's funny, the sentiment too from everyone is go fix DC, which he was like, well, I'm one guy. Let me lower expectations a little here.
435, yeah. Well,
But,
the other question is who's in control of the House right now?
Good
It's a
point. Yeah.
tenuous Republican majority,
It's true.
but that could change in November. And if he's
Instant,
in
right.
the minority party, things are more difficult because it's so heavily based on seniority, among other
Sure.
things.
Yeah. No, it'll be really interesting. But I said goodbye to Vince. I said a few words about Vince, but I actually got a chance to drive to Bakersfield with Vince at one point. So so obviously he represents Bakersfield,
Yes.
and he drives 5 hours each way every week, which is just a brutal commute.
Oh, yeah.
And I did it with him one time, and I was like, this is rough. And we had to stop and get some food. He's like, well, I usually just stop at McDonald's or something. Speaking of $20 minimum wage.
Yeah.
And he even has this like clip dip like holder on his air vent in his car for his chicken nuggets. So
Oh, my gosh.
he just puts the sauce in this little clip and he just dips them while he drives.
That's great.
I'm like, you are teaching me so much, Vince. This is. I hope I never spend this.
So
time,
does that
much
mean
time
his
in my
favorite
car.
thing is chicken McNuggets rather than a hamburger?
He loves
or
the
something?
nuggets. I
He
don't know.
does? Oh,
He's-
okay.
I don't. So
All
I
right.
don't know. But it was great. Sad to see him go. Really sad to see him go because of his expertise on the budget.
Yeah.
But also just because he was such a good colleague and
Yeah.
and really I think a very common sense voice in Sacramento, which I appreciated.
Yeah.
Another story: medium home price Inc. Median. I said,
Yeah.
let's try that again.
Half
Median
below, half over.
home price for the first time ever in California history has hit $900,000.
Crazy.
That is, it is really, really hard to even fathom that. To be
It
honest
is.
with you, that half of the houses in California are above $900,000 in cost.
Yeah. I mean, granted, it was
Um,
almost 30 years ago, but when my wife and I bought our first house in a nice area of Sacramento and probably 1,600 square feet, swimming pool in the backyard and all that. It was maybe $260,000. And what's worse too, I think, is kids today graduating college, let alone professional or graduate school, have hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt.
I know.
I mean, how do they ever afford a home?
It's pretty hard to imagine. I mean, and I think it just really underlines how out of control the housing costs have got in California, and we have a lot of work to do. I think to make things more affordable to build, make things easier to build.
Yeah.
We have obviously a big supply issue, but there's a lot of factors here, and this came from a report that the realtors do every few months, and it's just astounding stuff. I love reading the report because it really does give a really good picture of what's going on, but I think interest rates dropping to where they dropped. Nobody wants to leave their house right now, right? I think so. There's a lot of
if you were lucky enough to get in at
if you were in
level,
now you don't want to leave
right.
and you don't want to sell, and so there's just so many challenges going on right now that are all kind of coming to a head. So hopefully, we can continue to work to reduce those costs in California, but I think it's going to require some tough conversations about different policies that are making things so
primarily
expensive.
Supply and demand, and
for sure,
supply is limited, and it drives the cost. I mean, this is an example of very high school economics. I mean, this is the way things work.
Yeah. No, very true. So,
I mean, I guess it's great if you're a homeowner today.
Sure.
But what do we do about the people who are not
It's great if you don't need to
homeowners?
live anywhere afterwards. I mean, so what, you get $900,000 for your house, but then you got to go buy it.
Yeah, really, where do you find? I don't know. Do you go out of state? I don't know.
I guess, that's true. A lot of people are, sadly.
Yeah.
So, so we'll see. I'm going to skip down. I'll do one more story because I know we're running out of time, but we're going to have a lot of budget discussions over the next few weeks. As you know, the budget has to be passed by June 15th.
June 15th is coming quickly.
It's coming. It's right around the corner. The one thing that, EdSource did some good reporting on this week, but there is one section of the bill that really is just getting me worked up, and that is we're going to be spending $800 million on electric school buses, so a funding program to fund a new mandate in California to move buses to electric by, I think it's 2035. And we're defunding, this is coming from kind of internal discussions, but we're defunding about $300 million of that is coming from a preschool programs for children with disabilities. And I think a lot of my colleagues are really worked up about this. I'm mostly upset about it because I came from a school district, and districts are already going to electric as they can, as their diesel buses kind of go out of commission.
Yeah.
A lot of times they're replacing them with, there's some grants out there, right? And they're replacing them with electric school buses.
Okay.
They don't need to be told to do that, and they certainly don't need, I think, $800 million to do that because they're already doing it as needed. And so I think it's going to be an interesting story to follow, and it'll also be interesting. This is the governor's budget that's proposing this. I know that the majority in the legislature have some pretty big disagreements with the governor on some of his budgetary suggestions. So we'll see if this, continues to be in the legislature's budget, which, by the way, I think is releasing today. We won't get a chance to talk about it in this episode, but we're
maybe next week's guest.
I think next week, me and Joe Patterson next week probably will. We'll have to talk a little bit about where the budget differs for the supermajority and the governor. So it'll be interesting.
Well, certainly healthcare, Medi-Cal provider rates. That's a big area of difference. And
Well, and if you missed last week's episode, we dove way into the budget. So Tom Sheehy was here, and we dove into just the governor's budget as a whole. So go watch episode 36 if you want to hear that discussion. But last discussion of the week, and this kind of goes back to our House of Origin thing, but I'm going to put it in finger quotes, comprehensive retail theft package passed.
Sure. Well, there's one in each house. So.
Right, exactly, yeah. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, but to set it up, it'll be our clip of the week. I'm going to play a little clip from Gallagher, Assemblymember Gallagher this last week.
Okay.
want to acknowledge the good work that has been done, bipartisan work that has been done to increase the tools that we need to get at the scourge of retail theft that we've experienced in this state. These are all positive things. But if we think that that's all that needs to be done, we are sorely mistaken. And yes, this governor has called on us to do different things. The one thing this governor still won't do, even though the mayor of San Francisco has called for it, and the mayor of San Diego, our former colleague, has done it, is said that we have to reform Proposition 47. The governor still won't bring himself to do that. And I think that we need to force him to get there. Because anyone you talk to in law enforcement, if you go throughout this state and you talk to district attorneys, you talk to police officers, they will tell you that it's, unless you change 47, unless you reform Proposition 47, you cannot get out of the scourge of retail theft. So again, we need to move these bills forward today. We are supportive of them as Republicans, but we also know that there is more to do, and we better not be saying mission accomplished because the job is far from done. But it will get done in November. Thank you.
Interesting.
So obviously, my colleague, Assemblymember Gallagher, and I think a lot of us feel this way in my caucus, is that, yes, all of these bills are really good, and I'll pull up a list of the bills here so people kind of know what we're talking about, but that, more needs to be done, and I think at least my position is that we need to look at Proposition 47, which we're still waiting to hear if the initiative that did turn in about 900,000 signatures will qualify. I think that's still pending.
Yep.
Should be hearing that in the next couple weeks is my guess. But it's interesting. So the bills that, were passed, there were a number of bills on retail theft. One of the really interesting ones, and I was curious if you watched this debate, but there was a bill by a Assemblymember Wendy Carrillo, AB 1990, that would essentially authorize warrantless arrest for shoplifting not committed in the presence of a police officer.
Right.
Now, that was, right now, you almost have to commit something in the presence of an officer in order to be arrested for it. This bill was interesting to watch. I think was very unique because it was one of the few bills in the entire week where you had opposition from, she's a Democratic lawmaker, and she had opposition from her own side on it.
Yeah.
And it was actually
several were proponents of the bill.
And several were proponents. So you had a number of Democrats and Republicans that worked to pass this bill against opposition from another coalition of Democrats. And so it was really, it was just interesting to watch because we don't see that a lot.
Right.
We don't see that play out a lot, but she really does believe in this legislation. And we did get the bill passed out of the Assembly. We'll see how it fares in the Senate.
Yeah.
But there was a couple examples. This was, I guess, my second House of Origin, so it's kind of interesting. But there was a couple examples. That one where you saw that inter-party tension, and then another bill. There was a 54 vote gun bill that was struggling to get votes. Yeah, but it was authored by a legislator who used to be a Republican. Now a Democrat in the legislature, and couldn't get to that, really struggled to get to that supermajority threshold that it needed to pass. It was just interesting to watch some of those dynamics play out, just from my seat, kind of quietly sitting there, watching all of this take place.
No, I watched both from the Assembly gallery.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess this is what, a lot of political commentators have talked about, with such a I call it a super duper majority in both houses. Now you see splinters with the majority party.
Right.
And I think the narrower subset of either fentanyl, retail theft, just the broader crime issue. Obviously, there are, a Democrat and Republican viewpoint, as there are on most issues, but I also think obviously we've seen this in the Democratic caucus, that there are some who believe that the, lock them up and throw away the key has been unsuccessful, whether it's drug incarceration or petty theft, et cetera. And then others who, believe that stronger deterrents have to be in place. And that's within the Democratic Party itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that has been interesting. As you know, in both houses, the leaders have indicated a lack of desire, along with the governor, to touch Prop 47. And so I think they've attempted to craft packages that go as far as they can vis-a-vis Prop 47, but also as far as their individual caucuses may be willing to go. Because there are quite a few Democratic lawmakers in both houses, good or for bad, obviously, but who again believe that the enhancing criminal penalties and locking more people up has not brought us success, and therefore they don't want to do that anymore. And so there's a genuine tension there. And obviously, even amongst progressive members, there's been some disagreement, especially when it comes to retail theft affecting a lot of small businesses. A lot of women and minority-owned businesses have been repeatedly hit in different areas of the state with retail theft. And so...
No, it's going to be interesting to see, what happens. And then also with that pending, impending June 27th deadline.
Right.
Do any of these bills move the needle to get the proponents of that Proposition 47 reform initiative to pull it off the ballot? My prediction right now is that they do not. I think that does stay on the ballot in November, assuming it qualifies, which is an assumption that I'm making right now. But time will tell. We've got a month to really figure that out, and I'm sure there's going to be a number of discussions taking place on that. So
I'll be curious. As you well know, there are a couple other measures. Whether it's the financial literacy requirement, Private Attorneys General Act, PAGA, whether or not that reaches a legislative settlement or that stays on the November ballot or not. There are a couple of measures that could retain their spot or could ultimately come off between now and the end of June.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to watch. So
definitely.
We'll report back.
Going on while you're negotiating and agreeing to a current, $288 billion budget?
I think that's exactly the number, 288. So good memory.
Yes, just a few things to deal with over the next 4 weeks or so.
Really, 3.5 or 4 weeks. It's
well, wild, yes, as my friends who are the budget advisors often repeat. Remember, you got to walk it back 3 days for the 72-hour in print rule.
That's true.
So that applies for the June 27th as well, right?
That's
Any deal has to be done several days in advance, get the language fully drafted, and
June 12th for the budget, right? And then
that's when it's got to be in print.
June 24th for the
yes, but again, that's when it has to be in print.
So really, we're running out of time, is what you're saying.
It's coming. It's coming quickly. There's plenty of time, but it's coming quickly.
For sure. Chris, I appreciate you coming on. Any final thoughts before we send you off here?
No, these are the types of things that are why I love the institution and the process. I mean, it's great to be a part of these discussions, and I love the public policy that occurs on a daily basis in the California State Legislature. So thank you for your continued work in the Assembly.
Sure thing. And thank you for always tracking all of these fun statistics that we use in the Assembly. Definitely, I think pretty much everyone follows along with you there. So it's pretty great to have that. Next week, we're going to have another return guest in Assemblymember Joe Patterson. That probably means he won't be on, because when I announce it usually gets canceled.
That brings you bad luck.
But we'll see what happens. Joe Patterson's supposed to be on with us next week. If you want to share ideas for future shows, you can email us at pointoforderpod@gmail.com. Obviously, listen on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You can watch, subscribe, or follow on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, Threads, and Facebook at Point of Order Pod. And you can follow today's host on Twitter, myself at Joshua_Hoover. And then Chris is also a great follow at Chris Micheli, Micheli, if I'm spelling that correctly.
Assemblyman.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So give Chris a follow. Chris, thanks again. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you, sir. Look forward to it.
See you later.
Okay.